अन्तिम स्केड्युल्ड कार्यक्रममा यहाँ सबैलाई स्वागत छ। तर यो कन्फरेन्सको एउटा भाषाको प्रोटोकल चाहिँ अंग्रेजीमा गफ गर्ने भन्ने छ के। यो हाम्रो बाको साथीहरूले किन त्यसो गरे, यो छुट्टै गन्थनको विषय हो। त्यसैकारण मलाई त केही फरक पर्दैन, नेपाली र अंग्रेजीमा उत्तिकै गफ गरिदिन्छु। कति मान्छेलाई फरक पर्ला, त्यसकारण छलफलको दौरानमा पछि तपाईँलाई प्रश्न नेपालीमै सोध्न मन लाग्यो भने म त्यो चाहिँ स्वीकृति दिन्छु। But I'll do the rest of the proceedings in English. Welcome to the last scheduled event of this 3-day conference. I agreed to moderate this discussion partly because archives are very close to my heart as an individual and as a professional historian, but also it would give me the opportunity to thank Deepak Thapa and our colleagues in the Baha Secretariat for having put up this fabulous show. And I also agreed to do this because it would then give me the opportunity to introduce two very important colleagues and friends. If you get to know Shamik Mishra and Deepak Aryal, you'll first find out they are very modest human beings. Self-effacing is the word that I would use to describe themselves, but also doing very important work both as archivists and as researchers. Since they have jointly published a lot of things, I would not read out their separate publication lists, but also just simply indicate that as researchers, they have made important contributions to the history of books in Nepal, history of magazines in Nepal, history of printed ephemera in Nepal. As archivists working for Madan Puraskar, Pustakalaya, in the case of Deepak since 2005, and in the case of Shamik since 2007, they have been involved in MPP's several exhibitions. They have produced, in conjunction with various of their other colleagues, exhibition catalogs, both regarding, let's say, the first elections just before the first CA elections in 2008. They have also curated and published catalogs related to ephemera. They have published articles related to the use of graphics. And for several months now, I've been chasing them so that they can produce an article for a future issue of the journal Media Then on the use of pamphlets and ephemera during the referendum of 1980, especially in the region of Tansen. So it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce them and have them speak about archives. After the earthquake, the recent ones, there have been many public events and public writings which have referred to previous earthquakes that Nepal and the Himalayan region in general has seen. Some of that commentary has been addressed by historians, particularly Mishra and Deepak's own contributions to that debate has been very important. Today's presentation will focus on the 1934 earthquake revisited. It's a view from the archives, but it is also a view of the archives, in the sense that if we really want to get serious research done more on the 1990 Bikram Sambat earthquake, then we have to understand how archives are organized in different parts of the world. So this is my plan for today. I have introduced them. I'll let them speak for 30-35 minutes. Once they are done, if I feel like if I have anything else to add to whatever they have said immediately, I will do that. But then we'll open the floor for discussion. We'll have to close by around 6:45 or 6:50. But before that, if there are other points that I can interject in the conversation, I will also do that, and then probably end with some thoughts for, some more general thoughts about archives and archiving. Should I turn to you now? What's your plan? Okay. Shamik ji first. Shamik Mishra, Deepak Aryal.
Thank you, Pratyoush. Let me start this presentation with a little background. When we were asked by Mr. Deepak Thapa from Social Science Baha if we would be able to put up a presentation on 1934 earthquake, we were in two minds at first, because our own building had suffered structural damage during the recent earthquake, and our stacks are inside apple cartons. They are wrapped under tarpaulins, so we do not have access to them. But still, we thought this could be a good opportunity for outreach in terms of archives. So we accepted that offer, and thank you, Deepak sir, for this opportunity. So let's begin. Initially, we'll try to argue why revisiting the 1934 earthquake is essential as compared to other natural disasters that has taken place since the past centuries. And one of the reasons is the availability of archival materials. It is one of the major disasters from the past, that is the 1934 earthquake, of which we have more documentation than from earlier disasters. Say earthquakes from earlier centuries, like 1865, 1890, Bikram Sambat, we have only scant information about them. We do not have as much detail, but whereas of the 1934, we have quite a volume of records from demography to the number of casualties, from number of houses destroyed, to the list of major monuments destroyed, information on infrastructure damage, etc. These information are by no means more than adequate, as we will be showing in our presentation. However, as compared to information on earlier disasters, this one must be considered to have accumulated a sizable volume of records. And archives and records are what the academics must dig into for research of the past. The next reason that we argue why we must revisit the 1934 earthquake is that it clearly is the momentous event when the state assumed as its responsibility to respond to natural disasters and play active role in post-disaster situation, as is evident. For instance, we know that in the aftermath of the 1934 earthquake, the state initiated relief work, mobilized forces, volunteers, deployed state machinery, introduced special law, Jangi Kanun, like you can read on the screen, what would be done to the thieves, robbers, etc., with the aim to maintain security situation, provided emergency health care, and took measures for public health, initiated measures to ensure continuous supply of essentials like food and water, worked actively to restore electricity, telecommunication lines, etc. It also kept detailed records of the impact of the earthquake, as we just mentioned. The data and other information on that period, including those on the socio-economic aspects, will help researchers to assess the impact of the particular natural disaster from various perspectives, whether through the lens of a sociologist, anthropologist, political scientist, and so on. And we must revisit this earthquake for one more reason, and that is that, again, the state's role in reconstruction. We know the state provided loans for rebuilding, issued guidelines, building codes, introduced new technology, advised on earthquake preventing structures. Unless we try to understand why those guidelines were not implemented, we will never know why later building codes that the government made were not implemented, and we shall never know how we can work for implementation of the guidelines we will be preparing in the coming days. Similarly, well, you can see cement, the way to make cement, and in earlier slide you could see the important points that one should consider while building a house, and there are plenty of such information. Another reason is it was the first time when there were offers of support from foreign countries, institutions, as well as individuals. Concerns were shown, money was offered, even skills were offered, as is evident from archival records. But Prime Minister Juddha refused foreign support while accepting individual financial contributions from foreigners as well. The refusal most likely was to avoid the real and perceived dangers of foreign intervention in Nepal and its implications for the Rana regime. However, things would begin to change as under Juddha, Nepal made diplomatic overtures to countries like Germany, Italy, France, China, opened Nepal's legation in London a year after, among other things. Though it would take until 1951 for Nepal to agree to any bilateral support from a foreign country, the 1934 quake and the events surrounding must have been a crucial factor, if not the watershed moment in Nepal's foreign policy. For example, records show I mean, I'll be showing you the examples. So here's the list of the contributors. And this is particularly important to revisit because there is a popular narrative that says that, see, Prime Minister Judha had refused foreign aid for rebuilding, so we were rich then, and by 1954 floods, Nepal issued a general call for support to the international community for managing the post-flood situation, and this is from our archives, and this is about 954 floods, where it shows, this is just a piece of the list, like it shows a medical relief unit from the Indian government, which contributed 25,000 Indian rupees, and Relief Welfare Ambulance Corps from Calcutta. Similarly, Marwadi Relief Society from Calcutta. Its offer was rebuffed by Prime Minister Judha in 1934, but we can see that that organization their support was taken. Similarly, and there is this popular narrative that now, and by the point we reached this ICNR conference this year, we've become completely beggars. So, but the question to ask is that really so? Do we have the enough economic indicators of back then to really say that we were really rich? That's why Prime Minister Judha didn't accept the offer of foreign aid, or if there was this, and what were the conditions that induced Prime Minister Judha to rebuff the foreign aid? And this has also to do with issues like the loans that were written off later by Prime Minister Judha. Was that because our state coffers were overflowing with money? Or there were other reasons, there were other factors, or domestic and international factors that we will have to revisit. And that's why, and it has got these, we can join the dots from 1934 to 1954 to even 2015. So to understand that, we must revisit the 1934. And another factor that makes the 1934 earthquake interesting is that even then, it was the power struggle, politics on relief and reconstruction, like we hear today, like we get to read today. It was very much happening between different cliques of the Rana rulers, and who shall take the credit, who do we sideline. It may appear as well from reading from today's newspaper. So like this Reconstruction Authority, people vying to be the CEO, etc. So now that we have shown why it is so crucial for us to revisit 1934, we'll move on to what archival resources there are to start sifting through the layers of information. So at the very first comes the Vanshavalis, the chronicles. To understand the 1934 earthquake, we may not have as many Vanshavalis, as many chronicles that we have for earthquakes from earlier centuries, but we have not gone through it, but we're sure that there are records being kept at places like, say, the temple of the Setu Machindranath, Janabahal in Kathmandu, and the temple of Ratu Machindranath at Bungamati. We were sure that they've kept such records in the medieval format, but we'll have to access that to know how it was written down. Another source is the sawais, the ballads that used to be sung among the crowds. They used to be very popular, and we have around a dozen such sawais at MPP archive. And to say a general things, and we'll show you how important the ballads can be, the sawais can be. This is from Mahesh Raj Panta's wonderful article on Bikram Samvat 1865's earthquake, and in a lyrical form it tells you about the time, the space, the damage to the infrastructures. individuals, number of people killed, so everything. So that's why they are still important. However, as regarding the 1934 earthquake, there are certain limitations. They do, however, provide details that are not found in Gorkhapatra or Brahma Shamsher's Nepalko Mahabhukampa, but still they confirm to one line that they are not critical of the state, of the Prime Minister. They are, all of them are glorifying the rulers. And now the next resources comes the newspapers. And we have at our disposal only the Gorkhapatra, that invaluable source of on Nepali society since it started in 1901. But there can also be plenty of information in newspapers published from elsewhere, like from Patna, like from Calcutta, or it could be from London or elsewhere. However, when we talk about Gorkhapatra and the 1934 earthquake, Gorkhapatra and Brahma Shamsher's book, which I'm sure most of you are already familiar with, comes together. And why? I'll tell you why. Vis-a-vis the contents, the Gorkhapatra and Nepalko Mahabhukampa are not much different. In fact, the contents are so similar that there have been contestations on the actual authorship of the book. And Kamal Dixit has written a wonderful essay in one of his essay collections titled Char Kantha, and the title of the article is Utkhanan Kasari Garne. Such doubts may have arisen due to the reason that the source of information for Gorkhapatra as well as Brahma Shamsher was same, that is, the government, Nepal government. Further, Prem Raj Sharma, the editor of the Gorkhapatra at that time, is acknowledged in Brahma's book for proofreading, which shows they had definitely collaborated on the book in some capacity. Therefore, it may only be natural for the book to appear as a select compilation of information gleaned from the Gorkhapatra. These facts, however, in no way can take away the legal authorship of the book from Brahma Shamsher, and we will treat it as such. Now, on to this famous book. It would not be incorrect to say that the first reference that comes to our mind whenever the topic of the 1934 earthquake is brought up is the book titled Nepalko Mahabhukampa, The Great Earthquake of Nepal by Brahma Shamsher, first published in 1991 Bikram Sambat, then the second edition in 1992 Bikram Sambat, and the third edition brought out in 2041 Bikram Sambat. This is a very popular book, judging by the volume it is referred to and cited in research articles, reports, and popular write-ups alike. The publishers scrambled to reprint the book in the aftermath of the April 25 quake is therefore understandable. As you can see, 3 different publication houses have already reissued the book since April 25. One English translation of the book by Keshar Lal was already in the market since 2003. And this is to show that, this is the point that I was earlier referring to, the contents of the Gorkhapatra and Brahma Shamsher's book are not very different. They are almost same. There are more information in the Gorkhapatra than the Brahma Shamsher, so that's why it appears more like a compilation. But as you can see, the contents are very, very similar. Now on to Brahma's book. The book provides in great detail the account of the 1934 earthquake in and outside Nepal Valley, the prevailing situation in the immediate aftermath, the impact of the disaster in detail, the number of casualties, the account of rescue and relief efforts, the process of reconstruction and rebuilding, with more detail in the annex that also includes the names of people that contributed to the Earthquake Relief Fund. Replete with information and details as it is, the book, however, is not without some crucial limitations. Maisrajpant has provided a critique of the book regarding historical earthquakes and their dates in earlier articles and in his articles published after the April 25 quake, so we are not dealing with it at the moment. On the book, the contents of the book, firstly, it is not a primary source itself. It does have some primary source materials like the edicts, speeches, and information culled from the government agencies. However, the information are broad and do not include the details and descriptions that will shed more light on the workings of the relief organizations, their proceedings, and the response of the public. For instance, documents related to the Bhukampa Udharak Sanstha, the earthquake relief organization, like circulars, decrees, petitions, applications, registrations, disputes and contestations, accounts, financial transactions, etc., would provide rich description of the post-disaster efforts, rescue and relief, as well as reconstruction and rebuilding. Further, it would provide crucial information about who the actual beneficiaries of the state largesse were. As of now, we do not know. If there was any bias or prejudice of any kind on the part of the state in relief distribution and support, and so on, issues that must have been important then and continue to resonate today in one form or other in every subsequent natural disasters, including the post-April 2015 scenario. Even if one were to concede that the aim of Brahma Shamsher's book was not to include all the aforementioned details, the book quietly does take sides in the prevailing power struggle among the ruling factions, the details of which are conspicuous by their absence. If we have time, we can discuss about it later. The book mentions almost nothing that could have or might have gone wrong in the post-disaster situation, like relief and rescue, reconstruction, and rebuilding. Therefore, it appears a sanitized version of events equivalent to those published by the Gorkhapatra, the mouthpiece of the government. We thus argue that the book, while being very informative and the best book on the 1934 earthquake so far, has its limitations. For the academia, it seems as if there is no looking anywhere else, as shown by so many citations in research, articles, and popular writings. And if our understanding of the 1934 earthquake is to be based only upon this book, as seems to be the case, then it will be very limited, deeply flawed, and will not provide sufficient information required to study the quake as a natural disaster that we may be able to draw lessons from for other similar natural disasters in future. We cannot say for sure if the book was used as an agitprop by subsequent Rana governments to perpetuate the myth of an ideal response of the Nepali state to the natural disaster. However, as social scientists, if we think that it was the most efficient management of the post-disaster situation ever, we would say, Deepak and I would say, Brahma's purpose for writing the book will have been met. So, if Brahma's book is not sufficient, then where else we turn to? So, obviously, the National Archives, they have few piles of documents on related to the Earthquake Relief Organization and the Earthquake Relief Fund that was moved from the Kumari Chowk to the National Archives building where it stands today, but not all the documents are safe, and information is that particularly the documents related to the accounts were already damaged when they were moved. So, but still we know that we have some documents there. Archives of the Nepal Army, we know for sure from reliable sources that there are plenty of documents related to the 1934 earthquake as Army was mobilized widely. But I don't know what are the protocols of accessing those archives. Though we know that some historians have had access to the military archives who had students, army officers, their PhD students, and so on. So hospital records, chiefly comes the Beer Hospital records. I don't know. It should be there somewhere, the hospital records, and the records of the Tribhuvan Chandra Military Hospital, the building of which was recently taken down. But the army must have kept the hospital records there. Likewise, municipal records. Kathmandu was already a municipality by then, and quite a bit of volunteers and emergency care and other relief work was mobilized under the Kathmandu municipality. So we know that there must be records, but where they are, we have no idea, because Kathmandu municipality has the earlier building was brought down. The recent ones where they had been staying for a decade, it was also damaged during the earthquake. So I have no idea if any documents remains, but it's an educated guess. Similarly, archives at the National Archives, Delhi. We know they have some documents related to the 1934 quake. Even a cursory glance shows something, says something. Like, you know, so this is the catalog when you search, like number 1, you can see reconstruction of Nepal legation buildings damaged by the earthquake and review of the 4-year program for the reconstruction of legation. Similarly, on number 5, 1935, conferment of earthquake medal by Maharaja of Nepal to Lieutenant Colonel C.H. Smith, legation surgeon. And we know for sure that this surgeon's report is in, the report he filed is at the National Archives in Delhi. One Nepal scholar, Tom Robertson, has written about it a few years back. And message of sympathy, report on geological aspects by J.B. Auden. So we have also seen visits by many geologists since April 25. So many things are deja vu. Likewise, on number 8, you can see desire of Dr. Mrs. A.M. Pennell to visit the earthquake area in Nepal to assist in medical relief work. We do not know whether she was granted permission, but there we have the record. Similarly, deputation of a geologist to Nepal, supply of report on the earthquake. So I don't think it is there's something wrong typographical. It cannot be biotech, enjoy Nepal, so that's interesting. Okay, so this and the memoirs, memoirs that have tangential references to earthquakes, they also provide very interesting narratives. Like you can see, here, let me read out just 1 or 2 of the narratives. This one's from a peasant leader from Bhaktapur, reminisces from his childhood. After 3 hours, the military appeared in order to rescue those who were trapped beneath the rubbles and help the survivors to bear the approaching cold night. The affected families were given beddings and covers, while the military personnel were busy constructing temporary sheds. Those were the days of the Ranas. Thus, the rescue operation was immediate and effective. And here's one quote from Bhuvan Lal Pradhan's Nepalko Janakranti. विक्रम सम्वत 90 साल माघ 2 गतेको भूकम्पपछि झ्यालखानामा पानी नपाएको बेला यिनै खण्डमान सिंह मैना बहादुरको नेतृत्वमा सेन्ट्रल जेलका करिब 1300 कैदीहरूले कयौं दिन हडताल गरेका थिए. I mean, it's about a strike, general strike called by prison inmates in protest of lack of water in the immediate aftermath of the 1934 earthquake. So there are so on and so forth. We'll find references to how Judah made a big mistake by not accepting the foreign fund, offer of foreign aid that would have helped make Kathmandu a different place. From people, those who witnessed the 1934 earthquakes. Similarly, we'll find narratives of how Judah did right by not accepting the foreign aid, so on and so on. So we have interesting, colorful and conflicting narratives from memoirs. They are also one of the areas. So that's all for now. So if you have any queries and
one correction.
Thank you, Shamikji. Just to add to what you had said, if we're thinking about archives outside of Nepal, there are obviously the British records. For 1934, exactly in the slide that he listed, there are some documents obviously in the Indian National Archives. There must be other stuff in the British Library. But as far as I know, the Nepal or / Kathmandu residency records for the years 1792 to 1872 are available in the British Library in London. The years 1872 to 1922 are available in the Indian National Archives in Delhi. And nobody right now seems to know exactly where the Nepal residency records for the years 1923 to 1947 are located. Several of us have tried to search for these in both the British Library and the Indian National Archives. Bernardo Michael, our historian colleague who happens to be in Delhi right now, or at least some days ago, has told another colleague, Mark Lichty, that possibly these Kathmandu residency records for those years, 1923 to 1947, have not been catalogued, which means they are sitting in some big pile in the Indian National Archives waiting to be catalogued. Or they could be in the British Library and they have not been catalogued. So the documents that Shamik showed are dispersed in other kinds of departmental files, which, if you look at a lot of the work that has been done in the past of early 20th century or even 19th century Nepal-India-British relations, you will notice that many of the files that historians have quoted and seen and based their interpretations and have come from various departments. Those were not necessarily the residency records. Those were records, either they were pulled out as extracts from those residency records and kept in separate departments. Residency records are piles that were almost catalogued by years. And the resident in Kathmandu would oftentimes send an annual report with titles such as The Moral Progress of the Nepali People During the Year 1900. I've quoted some of these reports in some stuff that I've written in the past. Now, our colleague Yogesh Rajji has recently found out, just a few days ago, that a Swedish scholar has submitted a PhD dissertation at Heidelberg University. We don't know the exact title of the dissertation, but it was on the relief and reconstruction process after the Bihar-Nepal earthquake. We have no idea, as of now, exactly what sources she has been able to use in her dissertation. But when we find that out, we'd obviously know a lot more about archival information that she was able to gather both in the UK and in Nepal. Those would be for the 1934 earthquake. Shamik pointed out that many of the sources available in the Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya have come in the particular genre of sawais. This particular one for 1865 that he extracted from the article by Mishra was a sawai for the earthquake of, this would be 1865 Bikram Sambat, 1808 equivalent. The Kaliyug Laeko Sawai was written by Basanta Sarma, and it talks about extensive damages in Bhaktapur and Bungmati, two areas which have sustained serious damages this time around as well. So for comparative purposes, there are two lines there. Nyarka chorachori paryo ekai rota Bhadgaon saharko कोही मर्यो कोठा कोही मर्यो चोटा न्यारका छोराछोरी पार्यो एकै रोटा. Now, I think for two things, right? We have to read these as material published, put together in a particular genre. So we have to be able to not only read them as reportage, but also as literary sources of a particular genre and be able to read them between the lines as well. And these are skills that I think one can only have if you get trained in a particular way of reading things. And unfortunately, it's a skill that is not found in abundance in this town at the moment. We have to then go back and ask for other sources, where they are. In several articles that Mahesh Pantji has written in the last several years, he's talked about 5 earthquakes that happened between 1825 and 1834. Now, if you recall, those were the years when Brian Hodgson was living in this town. And Brian Hodgson was interested on everything under the sun. And his collection has been catalogued through a grant that, for which money was raised by David Gellner and Michael Hart back in the year 2001-2. Apparently, there's nothing in the Brian Hodgson collection about these earthquakes, which is absolutely stunning. Either the catalogers or those involved in looking at the material have missed. Because knowing Hudson's other works, it's absolutely stunning that he would have nothing to say about these 5 and more earthquakes that would have taken place in the 23 years plus that he lived in this town. And some of these earthquakes had devastating consequences, not all of them. Clearly, Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya has emerged as a vital archival source. But for early 20th century Nepal, the study would have to include sources and archives that are, in a sense, all over the world. So when we get to know more about Eleanor's work, we will probably know a lot more about state-level archives just across the border, possibly in Patna, possibly in Lucknow. Tons and tons of stuff that only she has looked at or somebody else has looked at. I'll stop there and open the floor. You probably have questions and comments. I would want your comments and questions to be brief so that a lot of people get to speak. They know a lot about Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya. I haven't actually described it, hoping that they would do it themselves. But if they don't, I will do that at the end. So I'll open the floor. There are mics. Several of our colleagues are there with mics. Please raise your hand, identify yourself, and then just ask.
It's my understanding that 1934 earthquake was 8.2 on Richter scale. However, I did some research on the internet and they said that the Richter scale was used only since 1935, 1 year after 1934 earthquake in Nepal. How could this intensity of earthquake been said? Have you any information about how strong the earthquake was? And another thing I would like to know, I think in many towns in the Tarai and also in the state of Bihar in India were affected. Do you have any information on that? From the archives about the extent of damage in Bihar, the same earthquake that struck Nepal?
Hello, I'm Pravin from Nepal School. My interest is in if you have any records of songs about the earthquake, because it seems unlikely, but recently I found that there were songs or especially bhajans about the Rana period, as back as beginning of Rana period itself. They have survived through bhajans. So I wonder if you have access to those any of those songs, or what might be significance of finding those songs. Yeah.
If I could just add, have you had a chance to, as anybody in the Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya, have had a chance to listen to the collection of Terence Beck?
Terence Beck.
That has been repatriated from Indiana?
No, we have just scanned through the lists, but we haven't had the opportunity to listen through all of it.
So you might want to tell them what the collection is,
okay,
and answer the two questions.
Okay. So, well, let me first answer or comment about the two questions. Prakash Raj sir, your question is very interesting about the use of Richter scale. I'm afraid we haven't looked into it because we were more concerned with the resources. I mean, where could be the archives, where are the archives, and a different way to look at 1934. So we haven't had the opportunity to study this issue with the Richter scale or the Mercalli scale or whatever. So that's an interesting question. Maybe some in the audience may be able to answer that question. And regarding the damages in Bihar, different parts of Bihar, some of the Sawais do describe the damages in the Bihar, but we cannot be sure where, what sources they were called from, but nevertheless they are in lyrical forms. The Sawais, they describe the damage in Bihar, like the town of Munger, what happened to, and Sitamarhi, etc., etc. So there are references to the towns of Bihar and the damages there. And regarding the songs, were you asking particularly about the songs related to earthquake? Or
Yes, songs related to earthquake, like if they have survived in people's narratives in the forms of bhajan songs. Because recently I found, like heard from some friends that bhajans related to the Rana period were still sung in Swambhu. Also, like in my own locality, I found that I talked to some of my some of my grandparents and their friends, and they said that they used to sing songs of Rana rulers then. So like. Like this also evoked my interest on finding like if there were songs related to disasters, and in particular if there were songs, bhajans especially related to those earthquake or later earthquakes.
Okay, my colleague Deepak will answer this question.
We haven't found a direct relation with the song, but there are some songs which are more related with the God and Kali Yug and something. In that particular song, 2 lines are related, or 2 lines are written about the earthquake. Just that is not whole part of the earthquake, but it is in somewhere they have mentioned the earthquake in their songs. But we haven't seen the whole songs published like Sawai.
And about the Terence Beck collection, it is a collection that was put together by Terence Beck, ethnomusicologist, when he was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal in the 60s and the 70s. It has got around more than 2,000 hours of recordings of songs from different parts of Nepal, east, west, north, south. So he went on recording the songs, transcribing them, making, later he also made catalogs. So it originally is deposited at the Indiana University archives of the traditional music, but we were fortunate that Terence Beck trusted us to have a copy of his collection at MPP. So we could have a copy of that about 3 years back, and so you can come and listen to that collection. And that collection is important in the sense that what Beck recorded in the 60s and the 70s, we didn't have other media like we have today. Even the reach of radio was not that pervasive, which later would go on to influence the genre of folk music, etc. So we believe it is very much closer to what form of music might have been in existence, say 100 or 200 years back. So that's what you were asking.
When I first visited the archive in Bloomington, where the original source of the Terence Beck collection is, in 1993, my dhyana was on Gorkha Dukha, and so when I listened to some of the audio tapes and listened to the archives and the transcribed autobiography of some of the singers, I didn't pay attention to if anybody was talking about the 1934 ko Bhuinchalo. But it's entirely possible because there's a lot of stuff, amazing stuff in those songs, so that, when we might actually be sitting in an archive right in Patan that has a lot of stuff on Bhuinchalo of 1990. I mean, it's entirely possible.
Yeah, and you had flagged about this collection in one of your articles in the Himal Salvations. So
yes, please.
Hello, my name is Tashi. I'm with Baha. My question is, do these archives tell us about the damages in other parts of Nepal also, or except Kathmandu? Thanks.
Well, okay.
Thank you for your presentation. Well, I have a question. I wonder whether there were some policy documents and the documents on the programs initiated by the Rana regime in the subsequent period. There might be some account about the account in relation to the impact of the earthquake and how the regime should deal with the impact. So did you come across that kind of account in your archival studies?
I wonder whether, and this is a question about archives rather than about this particular archive, I wonder if anybody knows about the archive in Betia, which I visited Betia just for a day last year, but and what I could gather from my local informant was the archives are in a pretty dire state there, but if somebody needs to go through them, because I think they've got a lot of material highly relevant to Nepal, and probably have got stuff on the earthquake as well.
And relating to the question, if the archives mention something about places outside the Kathmandu Valley, there are mention of places like Purba number 1, 2 or certain districts, but we have to admit it is one of the lacking things in archives, not only in not only at MPP, but I'm sure it is the same at the National Archives as well. There are more information about the Nepal Valley than about Mofassil. That is what it used to be called. And this has to do a lot with the centralized state or the kind of situation that was prevailing at that time. But also, like even if we go through the memoirs that make reference, that make mention of the 1934 earthquake, we'll see that most of the people are from Kathmandu Valley. So you see, it starts with something like, I was 5 years old when the great earthquake happened, or I was born 2 years after the earthquake. So, but most of the people are from Kathmandu Valley. It's unfortunate. I mean, this is where we should also focus to try to get information from outside Valley as well, and an oral history could be one good way. The kids who witnessed the earthquake are well into their late 80s or even 90s. So we are running against time, but it still should not be impossible if we really serious about it. And regarding if we've come across any documents, at the moment we cannot access our own archives. So all we have is the MBP catalog that you can also browse online. And from that we haven't been able to find, but I'm sure there must be something, I'm sure. And as I mentioned, at the National Archives, they have the documents related to earthquake relief and reconstruction. So, thank you, Dr. Gellner, for the information on Betia archives. So we understand that it is very crucial.
One Sawai, writer from Kaski and published from Banaras, only talks about the Kathmandu Valley. That is one aspect.
I just wanted to add to David's point, which is at a lower level than the state archives in Patna and Lucknow. I think David is absolutely correct that there are other local archives all across the southern side of the Nepal border. Yogesh has himself been into one or few of these in West Bengal. So it's absolutely essential that we also pay attention to that level. I forgot to mention that earlier. Inside Kathmandu, I think the Asasafu archives, world's largest repository of Newar language collection, also would be a proper stop for anybody interested in the early 20th century, including the 1930 earthquake. I saw some hands. Yes, please.
My name is Rajendra Raj Timilsina. My query concerns with the Sawai of Maheswaraj Panta. You have mentioned the date Bikram Sambat 1865, that is 1865 Bikram era. The Sawai. If we convert this date to AD, it might be 1808. As I know, there were two major earthquakes, one 1934, and before another largest was 1833. recently I was there, Seismological Center or Department of Mines briefed President Dr. Rambaran Yadav, and I was there. Dr. Somnath Sapkota briefed that earthquake 2015 is repetition of 1833 because the epicenter and damages are happening in same places as they were happened in 1833. My concern is this date is correct or there was another earthquake at that time? Bikram Sambat 1865.
I'm not sure. Can you answer? Okay.
I just quote from the Mishra and Deepak. Last line of his article. रातो मच्छेन्द्रनाथको रथ यात्रा बुङमतीबाट सुरु भएको 4 दिनमा विक्रम सम्मत 2072 को भुइँचालो गएको र विक्रम सम्मत 1865 को भुइँचालो चाहिँ रथ यात्रा सिद्धि मच्छेन्द्रलाई बुङमती लगेको 4 दिनमा गएकोलाई संयोग नै मान्नु पर्ला। यी दुवै भुइँचालो शनिबारै गएकोलाई पनि थप संयोग मानेमा फरक पर्दैन। First, there was assumption that it is near or similar with 1934, but Maharaj has some reservation on it, and he says not like 1834, but it is like 1865 BS.
Could I just clarify? What Maharaj is trying to do is that he's trying to suggest that in each of these years there were many earthquakes to begin with. So if in popular narrative, if 90 सालको भुइँचालो had often been compared to the 1890 सालको भुइँचालो, it's likely that in 1890 and 91 there were several भुइँचालोस. One of the points that Mahesh ji has been trying to argue is that possibly the 1865 Bikram Sambat ko भुइँचालो, which you refer to Rajendra ji, which comes to 1808 AD, had far more devastating consequences than the 1833 and 1834 Bhuinchalos, for which we seem to have very little details. But he's provided some sources for the 1865 Bhuinchalo, including the Sawai that from Basanta Sarma that he showed in one of the slides, to suggest that perhaps 1890 is not comparable to 1990, but 1865 is. That's his argument. I'm just clarifying that. I saw some hands at the back. And yes, please. If you could identify yourself when you speak.
Oh, okay, sure. I have to stand. Amy Johnson. Hi, thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask a question because we're focused here on textual sources, but I wanted to ask if there's been any research at all so far on oral histories. I would suspect, given the age of people who would have lived through this particular experience, that it would be very difficult at this stage to do so. But I'm thinking about the transmission of historical memories about the earthquake in places, especially outside of the Kathmandu Valley, that could be very illuminating at this time. And then in addition to that, given that there was an influx of anthropologists, geographers, ethnographers in the decades after the earthquake, if it's possible to look through some of their collections, unpublished papers, or just notes, and thinking about whether they would have commented on the material destruction they could have seen, the remnants of, or also just tales that they heard from people that they were encountering during their research. Yeah.
Thank you for this presentation and this work. So I very much respect and appreciate the value of historicized knowledge. But I want to ask the maybe ignorant question. If you could give an example of how historicizing our knowledge about earthquakes in Nepal can help us to interpret and understand sort of the politics of the state's current efforts at reconstruction, or those of other actors as well. That you go ahead and tell me.
Yeah, this seems a very okay. I have a question. So for the sake, will you attempt?
Why Posahavi?
Okay. More questions. Okay. The first question: if we have oral history records of people from outside Kathmandu Valley, we have very little, very little. As I mentioned, there needs to be a campaign. Otherwise, apart from one or two stray references, we do not have much from outside Kathmandu. And regarding the benefits of historicizing our knowledge on earthquakes, so what we're trying to say is that it need not be only earthquakes. It can be any natural disaster. It can be floods. It can be landslips. It can be earthquakes. So, and all these are these momentous events. They have impact on other components of the society. The structure of the society, the culture, state, everything, as we can see. So we hope that if we are able to scrutinize these events carefully from different perspectives, then we may be able to draw lessons from. So like I said in our presentation, several things remain the same. The scramble for power, the upheaval, the cultural upheaval, and the painful process of reconstruction. So it cannot be, say, very different from one disaster or the other. So that's what I have to say at the moment, but I'm sure my colleague who also made some interesting point, Bhaskarji, may be able to explain it better. He's also done some research on this. He's been doing. So Bhaskarji, if you'd like to take up the question, to add some more.
Could I ask for the mic to be given to Tanak?
Namaste, I'm Kanak Mani Dikshit. In relation to the politicization or the need to study the past to understand the present, I have no doubt that is important, because we will always learn from the past. And the most important aspect for me in the presentation was to understand that Brahma Samsir and everything else that came out there, all the information that they provided, has to be seen through the screen of the possibility that they are trying to create support for the particular regime of the day of which he was a part. So I thought that then that is obviously something that we've got to go deeper into to find the nuances of bias, and then to go into all the other sources that Pratyoush talked about that is probably out there, including from the notes of former anthropologists. I'm sure they would have located stuff. I wanted to add just 2 points. One is to learn from the past to try to understand the present. Take one example. It is already 3 weeks or maybe even more since the ICNR conference, the International Conference on Reconstruction of Nepal. But we've already got bogged down in the politics of the day, enough to forget this last earthquake, enough not to want to ask why there is no, why the Reconstruction Authority has not been set up. We're already running with the ball, so to speak, in a different direction. So I think these things require us to look back and then study the present. One last point, just about what Professor Gellner talked about, the need for looking at the Betia archives. I think just the way that Professor Gellner and others were involved in reaching back to the archives of Hudson and to have them catalogued and put before the public for researchers. Likewise, probably a similar effort is required to look for archives on Nepal, from Lucknow to Betia to Darjeeling, maybe in Uttarakhand, elsewhere along the rimland around Nepal. I think that if we could do that, we may find out a lot about the earthquake, but also much more about Nepal's own history. Thank you.
Actually, I've gone through the book of Prabhu Samsir, and I haven't found any informal or religious causes behind the earthquake. Actually, but this time so much evidences are available, such as cheer ढल्ने type of thing. And त्यस्तै गरेर पशुपतिनाथमा some people have climbed in पशुपतिनाथ. त्यस्तै गरेर मान्छेले चाहिँ के पिपल पोर्ट्रे कुमारीको पोर्ट्रेलाई चाहिँ बिगार्यो अनि त्यही टाइममा मिटिङ बस्दा बस्दै भुइँचालो आयो पिपल न्यारेटेड इन द्याट वे है तर प्रभु शमशेर hasn't mentioned such type of things in his book actually and other thing is त्यस्तो religious some types of symbols were seen during the time of this time's earthquake. Likewise people are saying that cow was slaughtered in maybe in Dolakha and some boy came over there and he said please don't kill the cow. Such type of narration is seen in Dolakha and people from this Kathmandu are saying that during the
your comment
portrait
or question please.
I know it's a comment actually. हैन such type of things त्यो पहिलाको आर्काइभहरुमा छ कि छैन भन्ने कुरा हो कि अब त्यो प्रभु शमशेरको बुकमा चाहिँ मैले यस्तो टाइपको के न्यारेसनहरु भेटेन हैन मान्छेले भनेको कुराहरु अब यो पनि सोर्सेस अफ एभिडेन्स हो नि त यो रिजनले गर्दा भयो अब यसमा त डाइरेक्ट रिजन छ के भने when there was meeting के रे earthquake happened कि when ministers were there in the meeting the earthquake was directly happened कि त्यस्तो टाइपको some evidence I haven't found in Prabhu Shamsher's book maybe on other archives I've said.
Thank you, you made your point.
Regarding your comment that Brahma Shamsher's book does not have that, let me read. Well, it does mention at some point the auspicious or inauspicious alignment of stars. So I guess the astrology part is there. And we also find in several memoirs, particularly in the memoirs of Sardar Bhimbahadur Pandey, that Mohan Shamsher very much believed in astrology, and based on the advice of astrologers, he had been camping outside his palace when the earthquake happened. So there are such incidences. I think the question that we can ponder about is how we perceive the earthquake. So as we know, earlier it used to be God's wrath, the big Prakop. So even during 1934, as all the ballads, the Sawais and memoirs say, there is some attribution to the god, but at the same time the response is pretty much modern, I would say. The response is very pragmatic, and the interesting question would be what things have changed from the time when we used to believe that natural disasters were the wrath of gods to the point when we believe that they are the wraths of nature, to the point where today we say that all disasters are man-made. Earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do, droughts do not cause famine, it is the failure of distribution. So I think that angle would be more interesting. How far we have come, or we remain the same.
Okay. My question is, I sort of understand the need for archives and more archives, and to look for more sources. But the question is, for whom are the archives? Now I'm saying this because Totis also stated that there are very few Nepalese who are able to read the archives. So whom are you collecting the archives for, is the question I would ask. And who would read them, would use them? Would it be people like this, young people like this, like I know Deepak is working a long time, or others? Are you collecting archives for PhD scholars? Well, that's good to ask.
I'm Puspa from Galdi Galli. I just wanted to ask, do we have archives of disaster other than earthquake, like flood, landslide?
Hi, my name's Austin Lord. I mentioned yesterday during the panel about the practice of preventing forgetting, and I think that there's a huge value to the work of going through archives. While we have the leader of Martin Chautari on stage, I'd just like to ask if it's if there are comparisons, or in what ways you see them as symbiotic, the work that you're doing here and the work that's being done, which was mentioned briefly, by the rest of the Martin Chautari team that's doing the current audit of kind of the way data is being produced in real time and being propagated, which I think would be a fascinating comparative study. Thank you.
Regarding Rajendra Pradhan Sir's question, who do we archive for? This is a very important question, and it has far-reaching implications, because that question is very theoretical, and it comes with lots of assumptions and presumptions. Like, well, to begin with, there is, no archives can be value-free. There is the certain process of sorting. You keep this or you do not keep that. For instance, MPP is an archive of Nepali language. The ASA archives is the archive of Newari language, and so on and so forth. So there are focus. But who do we archive for? In general, I would say the society and the humanity. So because an anthropologist comes to an archive, he will find his own answers to his own questions. A sociologist will come, he'll look for his own answer through his own lens. And, well, if it is about, whether it is about the lay people then I think whoever has interest, one need not have academic degrees to visit archives. So I would say it is for everybody who come to use. And I don't know if that satisfies you. And then regarding the question, if we have a particular archive of the landslide, I have to admit that, of natural disasters, isn't it? So we do not have any particular archive dedicated to natural disasters as such. In fact, it will be a very tall proposition, because at the moment, all we can do is we can cull information about natural disasters from the existing archives. So that's how it is more efficient, and that's how it has to be done. There has so far not been any such repository specializing in natural disasters. But given that we face so many natural disasters every year, and since centuries, and we have records of them all, it's a good idea to have a repository that will have all the details available on natural disasters.
Thank you. Prakashji, this is round 2 for you, so you'll have to be very brief.
I would like to know if you found any information on where the epicenter of 1934 earthquake was located. My information was that it was in the eastern hills near Chainpur. I don't know where I saw it. And the second question is, how long did the aftershocks continue? Like, in Kathmandu, we had 2 days ago, we had aftershock. So in that way, in Assam earthquake, the aftershocks continued for 2 years. So I'm interested in knowing what do the archives say about that.
Thank you for the question, sir, but I do not have the answer. So maybe if someone can contribute from the audience. That's a very technical question for me. Maybe it would require a geologist.
I'll take one more.
Thank you for your presentation. Andre Lin from Singapore. I want to ask a question whether or not you've archived and data on the causes of building collapse in the previous earthquakes, because that will give us a good idea why history was repeated. I have seen many sites and was appalled to see that poorly made mortar, like mud and perhaps some kind of animal feces, put together as a binding agent for bricks and putting it as high as 3-story high. And don't you think that if all these studies were done properly as to assess the real causes of death previously, the current number of people who have died could have been avoided. And I've also seen very bad quality workmanship by contractors using non-conforming code of practice in joining reinforcement or even no reinforcement or poor quality cement and rusty iron rods and rebars. So I'm just wondering if this data is available and we can study it and we can sort of push out reformative programs, especially contractors. Even today, they are still trying to cheat people who are trying to rebuild their house by using substandard materials. Thank you very much.
I just couldn't resist because it is coincidental. The lady from Gully Gully has questioned about whether there are archives or information on events other than earthquakes. And today's, I think it is Republica or Kathmandu Post, there's an article by Sharad Khimere, if I'm right, and one other person. And they have looked, obviously they have looked at archives in the US State Department records as well as in Nepal to look into the aftermath of the 1954 floods. So what my suggestion would be that there are obviously, as discussed here for the 1934 earthquake, but for other earlier earthquakes, there are obviously material out there. Proof is in that article, if I am not mistaken, in today's papers. Two scholars that have looked into archives. One, the other is relating to the last comment made by the gentleman from Singapore. I think talking about the usefulness of archives, for example, if you went into any of these temples and Rana palaces as well, but earlier temples, most of the time you see that it is not poor workmanship, but lack of maintenance and upkeep. So, do the archives of Machinanath Bungdeo in Bungamati or in Seto Machinanath or Janabaha, do they indicate a regular maintenance procedure? Because it seems that these temples, there is some talk that every 80 years or so, temples would be redone. Now I think that is where an archive again would be useful, maybe not what's available in MPP archive, but in earlier archives, because there have been record taking in Nepal since centuries. Thank you.
The article that you mentioned, Conductor, was by Sharad Khimere and Tom Robertson, published in today's Nepali Times. So for reference, and whether we have data on the cause of building collapses from earlier disaster, I have no idea. I mean, such kind of data would be very useful, sir, as you mentioned, but I'm not aware. Are we aware of such a publication? But no, I have no idea, sorry.
We have to end all good sessions, so I will now stop taking questions. You'll have to ask them, as we walk out. With respect to Kanakji's point, Sharad Khimere and Tom Robertson's article, it's based on separate works they have done. Sharad Khimere's work on the 1954 floods was based entirely on Gorkhapatra that he read the microfilm of in the National Archives. The longer version of those 1954 flood, Sharad's article has been published in two places, the exact same article, in volume 18 in Studies in Nepali History and Society, and also it was included in Ruptures and Repairs in South Asia, edited by Yogesh Raj. Tom Robertson, on the other hand, has been looking at the early American development projects in Nepal, and for the first time, he's been looking at American National Archives and state archives in Washington in particular, and has been producing good stuff that has not been published yet, but it's in the making. I've just recently read an article draft by him on the first 3-4 years of American presence in Kathmandu, 1951-54. With respect to some general closing thoughts, I must say that Shamik and Deepak were able to talk about a lot of things from the Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya, because Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya exists. And without the lifelong labor of love of Kamal Dixit, the library which is really a reference archive, wouldn't exist today. In the past, Mr. Dixit has been described as a draconian librarian who didn't allow access to his collection by people who probably had personal grudges against him. But from the time I was a doctoral student, I arrived here to do my work in 1992, I have used the archive on and on, off and off, several times. In a paper that is not completely written, I look at 3 institutions that were founded by sons of Chandra Samser. Or, I should put it, by money that came from the 3 sons of Chandra Samser. Madan Samser went into the making of Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya. Baba Samser contributed to the making of Nepal Sanskritic Sangh, and Kesar Samser obviously contributed to the making of the Kesar Library, which exists, but it also contributed to the making of a very short-lived, but an important organization that existed in the 50s, Nepal Sanskritic Parishad. If you think about the longevity of these, when L.S. Baral, Ishwar Baral left Kathmandu in 1956 to pursue higher studies and teaching job in India, the Sanskritic Parishad disappeared virtually, and it ended its life in 1964 when Kesar Samser died. Nepal Sanskritic Sangh still survives in a compound in Dili Bazar, Kalikastan, right opposite that monster of a building that exists. It still is, at one point it was a very important location for all kinds of gaf and serious gaf in Kathmandu. I think it now serves more as a biako bhojko banquet than for an intellectual. I'm sorry, that's the way I speak. So, and Madan Puraskar, instead, when we are able to access the archive, right now they're not accessible, as Shamik said, boxed, all the items are boxed, sitting in a tarpaulin. It is a fabulous resource. It's the largest repository of Nepali language materials in the world. As some of you know, I spent the first 10 years of my life as a professional historian debunking or deconstructing how Nepali language became our mother tongue, or almost the Rashtriya Bhasha, and how Bhanubhakta Baje became all of our Bajes. I mean, all of our Nepalese Bajes. I think particular trajectories of Nepali language nationalism has obviated our attention in such a way that we tend to think about Nepali language sources as a parochial source. Whether we like it or not, Nepali language source is the source for a greater part of late 19th century and 20th century Nepal. Earlier this week, I handed the 23rd book that my father has put together to Mr. Dixit in the Nepali language. And my father does not appear in the landscape of Nepali literary writers anywhere. I think as a Kabi and as an Anubadak and as a Bangsawali writer and as a few other things, as an administrator of Red Cross, he's used the language to communicate. And I'm fast giving him a competition by reaching that 23rd number myself. And I have not used the language as a vehicle to do a particular kind of, let's say, the nationalist dance. So if we could imagine a Nepal in which there are resources available that can be used by all kinds of people, including those who have a nationalist agenda, then it will be fabulous for us, because then we could have competing interpretations of all kinds of things, including the 1934 archive, where people who would advocate the point that he was making today, probably for the very first time, which is Brahma Samser's father, Baba Samser, when Juda Samser banished the Class C Ranas from Kathmandu, Baba Samser, before that, he was 10th in the roll crum of prime ministers. The banishment meant he jumped, he had 3 double promotions, he became 4th in the line. And I think everything from the 1930s politics, we have to put together that in perspective. I think the Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya went into a transition around 1996. I would like to put it there, that date, because I was there. When our longtime friend Mary Desin sacrificed $10,000 of her personal grant to buy a second-hand microfilming machine and pay for the transport of that machine to Kathmandu. I was a co-applicant of that grant. But I was not mentioned as one of the co-applicants because I didn't really have a PhD degree at that point. Without that machine, the work that eventually became possible in Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya in terms of digitalization wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have made possible the digitization, the co-work that they were able to do, and the team led by Amar Gurung that Madan Puraskar was able to do with the University of Chicago's office in Chennai couldn't have happened without that microfilming machine. So I think it's the sacrifice and labor of love of many individuals over many long years that has made the archive possible. Rajendra's question, do we have people, who are we building this archive for? I think the easy answer would be posterity, and we hopefully will have a Nepal where there are many people, Nepali scholars and researchers and journalists who would want to use archives as an everyday fact-checking place. As a historian, they would go to do things. But it is clearly pointed to a very important loss, which is increasingly, and this is a loss not only in Nepal, that anything before 1800, we are probably losing the skills to be able to read them. And these, I'm referring to written archives. This is obviously a point that has been made famous by Indologist Sheldon Pollack, based at Columbia, under the rubric of Crisis of the Classics. But we have our own versions, where when the two Panta brothers are no longer with us from the Samshodhan Mandal, we might not be able to read anything written from middle-level Nepal. I mean, this is a real crisis facing us as a scholarly community. But with respect to 20th century sources, I think there are many people who can read Nepali of all kinds. Do we have the skills, archival skills, to be able to catalog them? And in an article that Sarah Tamang and I wrote in December for the Kathmandu Post, we argued that these folks sitting next to me and their colleagues, led by a fabulous group, they have, over the course of the last several years, built the skills to learn things, and when they didn't know the stuff, contact anybody under the sun through email and through all the other fancy gadgets available today, and find out the places where they could go and learn those skills. Some of those skills can be learned over long distances through online sources and so forth. And the question then really boils down to, do we then have the money to be able to set up such archives and run them as facilities that are very user-friendly to all kinds of researchers? I mean, as a researcher, I would like to walk into some archive and say, please show me Madan Ruprekha 1970 because I want to read L.S. Baral's interview. Show me this, show me that. The sad fact is those user-friendly archives don't exist in Kathmandu. In the National Archives, at some point earlier when I used it to look for sources related to the First World War, this was some years ago, that you had to queue up, you had to reserve time for the use of the microfilm, and so forth. Now, do we have the money? I have in the past argued that if some of the money spent by my relatives in throwing out big Newar bhojis was siphoned off for research, we have the money. I mean, every week something happens amongst my large, 1,000+ colleagues, relatives in this town, and it's an ostentatious display of ugliness, where my relatives are come as brides to be in all kinds of gold, and some of that money could easily be diverted by their parents to resources that could contribute to social sciences. But I have in the past asked, are the bankers in Nepal interested in research related to their sector, the banking sector? If you look at the data available in the end of Saun every month, every bank, every commercial bank in Nepal makes billions of billions, almost, Arab rupiah ko nafa. Through commissions from remittances, through our, aliali thore savings, itadi, itadi. If they devoted even 0.1% of that savings through the banking association to support research and archival activities, we would be talking about crores of rupiah. And having run an organization for under 1 crore for many years, I know what a crore can do in Nepal. Okay, so is the money there? Yes. But as Rajendra sort of indicated, we've been fortunate and sometimes unfortunate to have had many Videshi colleagues come and do research in Nepal. I mean, since 1953, it's been a floodgate. And many of them have done fabulous things for Nepal as individuals. Oh, sorry, as fabulous things as individuals, fabulous things as scholars, fabulous things, given insights of fabulous nature. And I have in the past gone after them for doing crappy work, but I've also contributed to celebrating some of their work. And maybe the Gellners and the Hutts and the Ben Campbells should write to the DFID minister in their country and say, we've been working in Nepal and our tax dollars should be spent on some kind of an archive in Kathmandu. And the Sherry Ortners and the Don Messersmith and the Jim Fishers and Mark Lichties and what have you, if they get around and write to their State Department and their President Obama, who have you, maybe the USID might actually spend some money. If our French colleagues write to the French President, and through CNRS, etc., I think it's time that we tried some of these things. It's time that we engaged with dollar billionaires in the countries south of our border who contribute to endowments in Yale University. I mean, one of the richest universities in the world. If you walk around New Haven, you feel like you're walking on wealth. Why does Ambani need to contribute to an endowment in Yale University? Why can't he do it in Sikkim University or in Madan Puraskar? I think we haven't engaged in all of these avenues. And it would take more than just GOF to do this. The Britain-Nepal Academic Council would have to get its act together. The Association of Nepal Himalayan Studies will have to get its act together. The Social Science Baha will have to, Madan Chautari, Madan Puraskar. We'll have to get our act together if we want to see $1 million complex in, let's say, wherever, in Patandoka. Madan Puraskar already owns a jaga there. And $1 million is not a lot of money. DFID, a good source told us last year, repatriated more than 9 million pounds because they couldn't spend the money in Kathmandu last year. So, I think we have to put some of these things in perspective, in proper scale. It won't happen if we all behave like ceremonial monarchs. Do this, do that. It won't not going to happen. We'll have to be executive monarchs. We might even have to be some, lunatic monarch like, I won't name him. But it will happen if we try. If it will happen. And Madan Puraskar happens to be the context in which they have come. Our community, should support Asasafu Guti as if it was the thing to do. But the fact is, they haven't done that. Years ago, I sort of tried to sort of inculcate some discussion. It didn't go anywhere. I could go on, but dinner is waiting. So let me thank both Shamik and Deepak for the presentation that has allowed us to be here and conclude this conference. I don't know if somebody is providing a thanks after this to the organizers, but if not, I'll use the forum to do that. Deepak Thapa and the Secretariat at Baha and our colleagues in the other three organizations, BNSE, ANHS, CNRS, have done a fabulous job in getting this conference organized and given us reasons to be here. Thank you.